Hello and welcome back to Ethics and Society. And this week we're going to finish up Module 13, 13a on monogamy and 13b on terrorism and state-sponsored torture. So we'll get started here on, take a look at an argument presented by John McMurtry, this gentleman here. And he presents monogamy as a kind of restrictive form of social formation, we'll say. Monogamy, yes, it does mean one marriage. But for McMurtry in particular, he believes it's also a label for a kind of ownership over another human being's sexuality. And he has sort of four principles that he wishes to present to us that when you think of them all together is actually a kind of social control over individuals. And it doesn't matter the sex of the individual, it works with both partners. And the first thing he says is partners who agree to marry enter into this legal and contractual relationship. In other words, monogamy and marriage is a contract, and a contract that should not be broken. And if it is, it gets very expensive, as we know from divorce lawyers doing very, very well. But the notion that partners are not just in love, but now have entered into a binding legal and contractual relationship. So that will change things right off the bat. The number of partners that are involved in this marriage is always and only just two people. The third is that no person may participate in more than one marriage at the same time, because that is bigamy and that is against the law. And fourth, that no married person may engage in sexual relations outside of marriage. So it's a restrictive form of behavior, a restrictive relationship that you would have with another person. And for these four reasons, the contractual issue, the fact that it's only between two people, that you cannot have other contracts, marital contracts with other people, and sexual relations also are forbidden because it will break the contract, essentially. So if this is the case, McMurtry looks at sexuality in society as being regulated in and through the marital relationship, through monogamy. And again, the key here is monogamy, one person, one marriage to one other person. So it only affects two people. So what happens typically monogamy, right? It is a kind of affective relationship. And that affective relationship is one that's typically based on love or built upon love. It starts it. So it starts and is based on the notion of affective relationships, that you feel a strong kinship with that other person. You wish to be with them. You wish to share your life with them. So they are affective relationships rather than contractual relationships. And so that in itself builds a kind of sort of bubble into which you can live, depending how society may treat you. Right now with the pandemic, for example, that bubble of the family, or at least the couple, is very strong. But big surprise, the number of divorces has skyrocketed since the pandemic. So affective relationships, maybe McMurtry has a point. The second thing in terms of a monogamous relationship is it provides a very loving context, certainly an affective context for child rearing. So the child grows up in a loving family, or that certainly is the ideal. How often that happens is unfortunately not as often as it should be. And so these two ideas, the fact that it's based on a loving relationship and marriage also provides a loving context for child rearing, these two ideas McMurtry attacks. And he says, first of all, with the first one about the affective relationships, there's no real evidence, right, of a profound affection that couldn't also be produced in other ways. So not only is it very difficult to measure affective relationships because they are more qualitative rather than quantitative. It's not a matter of how much, it's what kind of affective relationship is being discussed here. And McMurtry says, look, there are other relationships that can produce the same sort of affective relationship between two individuals. And then also to the second claim, he says that, look, more and more couples are choosing not to have children. And the notion of child rearing just is not happening because individuals are choosing not to have children, not to rear children, or even to adopt them. So the notion of the need of a monogamous relationship for child rearing really is now being tested by more and more people choosing not to have kids. So McMurtry believes that there are some logical flaws, right? He's pointed out a couple of them already. But further, in terms of this affective relationship that is the foundation of monogamy, when we talk about the loving relationship between the partners and the loving context for child rearing, there are also other things that are going on that are equally important, and we need to consider them. And the first one is what he calls a centralized official control, right, from marriage. It could alienate partners, and it could also test the freedom that that person has within that monogamous relationship, that the degree of freedom gets tested as the person sort of moves outside of that immediate relationship and seeks to establish relationships with other members of the opposite sex or the same sex. So there is a kind of sort of unwritten law that says in a monogamous relationship that women cannot have male friends and men cannot have female friends that are not mutual friends. So that's what it means by this kind of official control of marriage, influencing and making rather problematic external relationships to itself. The second one is the notion of limitations. Marriage bond between two people restricts the number of adult sources of affection and instruction for the young. So in the same way as this notion of an official control that monogamy has over relationships between the two people in the monogamous relationship with members of the opposite sex primarily or the same sex, there's also the limitation of the kinds of relationships you will have that are also sources of affection. It will make problematic that monogamous relationship because of jealousy, because of lying, because of a whole range of things that make that monogamous relationship really difficult to maintain. Because without trust, that relationship will be tested. It will be sorely tested. And finally, the notion of exclusion, that if we were to go for a full affective relationship, the notion of erotic contact or a sexual relationship with those other people is not going to happen, because it would result in insecurity, jealousy, alienation, from one partner to the other. It will eventually break up that relationship. And McMurtry sees that as one of the reasons why we should never have them in the first place. Because if we have a natural disposition towards affective relationships, both in and outside of monogamy, why do we have monogamy in the first place? So not only do we have these issues in terms of the restrictive relationships that individuals can have with others outside of monogamy, but there's also the restriction of the marital union of these two individuals to prevent other groups of sort of lining up and, well, excuse the pun, marrying up, but certainly lining up with those relationships. So what he means is you would have a monogamous relationship made stronger by other groups, of which that monogamous relationship is one component of it. There's also a kind of what he calls a kind of sexual isolation, that if that is the case, there's a tendency when individuals are committed to only one person in this contractual relationship with another, that there could be moments or feelings of aggression or frustration, sexual fantasizing, a visit to a prostitute, an increase in the use of pornography, and a range of things that, again, render problematic the monogamous relationship that caused the problems in the first place. So this is essentially how McMurtry is viewing the marital relationship that is monogamy, that it forces all of these secondary issues upon these two and just leads to just a world of frustration. So one of the issues that is very important in terms of monogamy is the continued existence of prostitution. This has been an issue because in the past there have been sort of legal reworkings of what constitutes prostitution or sex workers as they are known now. We know in 2013 here in Canada, the Supreme Court ruled that laws governing prostitution were unconstitutional, but it didn't go far enough, because what happened was the act of prostitution became legal, but living off of the act of prostitution was still illegal. So if women or men or women were to practice prostitution, they essentially would have to give it away. And that's not a way to live, not at all. So if that was the case, then certainly the notion of prostitution had to be revamped seriously, and it had to be looked at completely differently. It had to be looked at as a form of work, which is continually the way or the approaches that are being taken these days to try to revamp these rulings. So on the one hand, prostitution is legal, but living off of prostitution and working as a sex worker is illegal. And so these issues still need to be addressed seriously. So McMurtry writes, the ground of our marriage institutions, the essential principle that underwrites all four restrictions, that we talked about this, is the maintenance by one man or woman of the effective right to exclude indefinitely all others from erotic access to the conjugal partner. So the one partner has exclusive access to the sexuality of the other. And so that is really no better than property rights. So this is what McMurtry is saying is with monogamy, we're talking about property rights, right? So we have a kind of enforcement of the right of exclusion. This is mine and mine alone. This is my property. And the idea of these four restrictions really now kind of become more serious when we look at it as monogamy as not only a legal contract, but a contract of private property. And that other person's sexual activities and sexual behavior and sexual life, right, becomes a kind of property. So he believes a marriage becomes a form of private property of one individual over another. So we had to look at prostitution very briefly as sort of not an alternative, but one of the effects of monogamy, because one is believed to coexist with the other. So one is the result of the other, and prostitution has been around for a very, very long time, but so is monogamy. And so McMurtry believes that these two really work together because one sort of creates the other. The restrictive environment of monogamy creates the world of prostitution, and this is the way he sees it. Now, another alternative to monogamy would be polygamy. In 2011, the Supreme Court of British Columbia upheld a ruling that said polygamy is illegal because it leads to a series of more serious issues: underage brides, teen pregnancies, sexual abuse, the subjection of women, and the defense for polygamy. George McIntosh believe that, look, there's no one being harmed here. There may be one man and 3 or 4 wives, or in certain cases, one wife and 3 or 4 men. Doesn't happen as often, but it does. But the notion that polygamy shouldn't even be considered a crime. It should simply be another social arrangement. But as you can see in 2011, the Supreme Court in BC did uphold the notion of polygamy as a crime. So it was still struck down, and it still is in the books as an illegal form of activity. So the issue here is we should ask ourselves, is polygamy morally wrong? Is there something inherently wrong with it? Because there are certainly, from what we look at in terms of popular culture, if we learn about polygamy or we know about polygamy, there is this notion of child brides, and we begin to wonder the question of consent versus coercion. Did these individuals, these young women, have a choice, right? Did they freely choose to be with this person? And do they understand the full ramifications of this relationship? So if polygamy itself is wrong, right, it would have to be because of the features that are specific to it. And ultimately, McMurtry argues that, look, polygamy is wrong simply because it isn't monogamy. It is a relationship that either one man will have with several women, or a woman will have with several men. And McMurtry looks at it as simply just another configuration built on affective relationships, right? Built on a loving household for child rearing. So he uses the model of monogamy to polygamy and sees that no, they both work. But ultimately, He says the reason why it's illegal is simply because it's not monogamy. There you go. And so monogamy promotes profound affections between partners, right? We believe so. That is certainly the reason why people enter into a marital contract, legal or otherwise, because they love each other. And it also provides a loving context for kids to grow up in. Monogamy is socially accepted, while polygamy and open marriages are not. It's just simply something that many people cannot wrap their heads around, because it is something that is just foreign to their worldview. And yet polygamy continues to exist. And in certain places, it's protected by law because of its religious affiliation. For example, in the U.S., polygamy is protected sometimes depending on what the sect is or the cult. They are protected, but believe me, they're still hounded. So to enter into a polygamous relationship is not easy, because you will have people talking about you, because it is not socially acceptable at the present time. Now, we are talking about monogamy. We're talking about alternatives, whether it is to avail oneself of prostitutes or sex workers, to enter into a polygamous relationship. Another possibility is polyamory. And the notion of polyamory really just simply means many loves. And that means being in love with more than one individual. And so you can have a series of relationships within the sort of larger polyamorous relationship where there are men and women that are involved. And this kind of thing really sort of came into came into being around the 1980s. And this woman here, Morning Glory Zell, really was sort of one of the first individuals to define it as a thing, right? As an alternative to monogamy, or even an alternative to polygamy, not polygamy, but yes, to polygamy. So she says polyamory differs from adultery because all of the partners know about each other's lovers, so there is no secrecy, right? There's no secrecy or betrayal. It is an open relationship with a number of adults who believe that this is what they wish to do. They're not coerced in any way. They choose to live in this way. And there it is, right? It is a possible alternative to monogamy. If you seek love with a person and that person happens to be affiliated or affectively related to another person, then it's up to you to decide to accept that or to walk away from it. And if you accept it, then you may be in a polyamorous relationship. So polyamory, by definition, the state of having multiple sexually or romantically committed relationships at the same time, but this is the important part, with the consent of all partners involved. No one is lying to each other. No one is being deceitful. No one is being dishonest. It is an open, consensual relationship that multiple adults have with one another that is based on affective relationships. Now, whether or not they raise children is secondary, but it is a relationship built on the very same premise as monogamy, affective relationships, except in this case, it's more than one. So monogamy, affective relationship, singular, polyamory, relationships in the plural. But the important thing is the consent of all partners involved. That's what makes it different. So polyamorous relationships, or communities you might want to call them, they emphasize love and honesty in the multiple partners that are involved in this particular group. Now, dishonesty and sexual frustration now allegedly would be diffused and simply not exist in a polyamorous relationship, because the very issues that McMurtry raises against monogamy are addressed and dealt with in the uniqueness of a polyamorous relationship. So this is how it's dealt with, and McMurtry believes that this is one of the alternatives, one of the options that we may have if we seek affective relationships, but we also don't see ourselves committed to one person. So he asks, but can polyamory deal effectively with sexual jealousy? That may come up. We don't know, and if it does, then the partners that are involved need to talk it out. Certainly don't need to involve lawyers, and we don't need to, split up the kids and you see them on the weekends, because there may not even be kids involved. But the issue becomes, is this an effective alternative to monogamy and the kind of sort of dishonesty and sexual frustration that may accompany unsuccessful monogamous relationships? As I'm saying all of this, I'm not saying that every single monogamous relationship fails. Every single one of them is filled with sexual frustration and lies and deceit. No. There are some that work very, very well and have lasted a very long time and will continue to until one of the partners passes away. But McMurtry is simply saying, can polyamory or polygamy be an alternative to the kinds of negative issues that are associated with monogamy? That's essentially what he's presenting to us. Now, Bertrand Russell, who was writing in the middle of the previous century, during the 20th century, kind of looked at the same issue and really kind of came up with similar ideas as McMurtry, and said, look, human sexuality is being viewed sort of irrationally. And it is. It's something that a lot of people don't like to talk about. Some like to just get up in your face and brag, and others are rather reluctant and they think it's a private matter. But human sexuality is not something that could be discussed in an honest and open way very often. There needs to be a degree of trust with that other person to be able to speak honestly. And Bertrand Russell sees that because we view it irrationally and we think irrationally about it, it's open to abuse, right? It's the notion of sexuality is open to abuse by people that wish to either confine it within a singular relationship, or others that wish to use it against other people, a whole range of things. But Russell believes that we view it irrationally. So, and he says that because it's not possible to produce a society in which there are very little sexual intercourse outside of marriage. And so a society, for the most part, needs to be built, typically has been built, on families, and those families together are communities. Those communities become neighborhoods. Those neighborhoods become small cities and larger cities, and they just radiate out. But the notion of having, according to Russell, sexuality sort of freely moving in amongst all these different configurations, all these different relationships, is something that apparently we have a great deal of difficulty with, to the point where we view it irrationally. And he says, because of that, right, influences towards monogamy, isolation, superstition, public opinion, right? The public opinion against polygamy and polyamory is still very, very strong because many people don't understand it, don't wish to understand it. But isolation and superstition. Isolation is the single person, one of the two partners in a monogamous relationship may feel isolated from their friends, male or female. Their acquaintances, they could be gaslit by the other partner into believing that their family doesn't care about them anymore. They have no friends. The degree of isolation within a so-called loving relationship, a monogamous one, can be very powerful. There's also superstition, right? The lies and the deceit and the sort of talking behind one's back, or and of course now with cell phones, all kinds of misinformation and sometimes completely, inoffensive texts that are misunderstood and misread in the heat of the moment. And superstition now flares up. The one partner does not trust the other partner. They think that they're screwing around on them. All these things will render problematic a monogamous relationship. Okay, the most important thing is the notion of jealousy. Right? Because if you are feeling jealous, you want something, right? You want something that other person has. And now we're back to that notion of a contract, right? A property contract. Because you're jealous of another person, of your partner spending time with another person. And you are jealous because they're not spending that time with you. And they seem to be kind of like smiling a lot more and just laughing and just somehow happier. They just seem to be happier with that other person. So you end up feeling jealous because you're wondering what's going on here. What's going on in his mind, her mind. So this notion of jealousy becomes a very powerful inducer of rage and very often violence. So jealousy is the root of often violent behavior and this notion of looking at someone as a piece of property. So Russell says that jealousy is very much connected with this sense of property. Now, if people had a degree of sexual freedom, then that would be less likely. I'm not going to say it disappears, but it would be less likely for the one partner to feel jealous towards the other, because the same degree of openness should be allowed to both partners. And that is the way in which it should work, because jealousy ultimately is that it's feeling protective on the one hand, but feeling protective, you can feel protective over a pet or a child, but there's a degree of protection now that borders on sexual jealousy, because that person, your partner, is acting differently with that other person, the way that you would wish for them to act with you. So therein lies a jealousy. And jealousy, like I say, leads very quickly to violence. Okay, so there's a series of issues that Russell brings up. And again, remember, this is the 1930s that he's writing this, so this is rather provocative. And when we are talking about alternatives, Russell says, look, even in monogamy, if you are going to have monogamy, we want to make sure that there is something else that is going on that is going to be fair to women. So it will be fair to both partners. And paternity, of course, is a very important one, because it is a social institution. It is something that is important when it comes to, for example, inheritance rights. You wish to know that that child that you're leaving your wealth to is in fact your child and not someone else's. And I'm not saying about adopting a child. It's about a child born into that family that you hope that it's yours. As Freud famously said, every child knows who their mother is. They're never 100% sure the father is. And that's really what paternity is all about. And so Russell offers some suggestions, some recommendations for individuals to think about, primarily women here. And he says, okay, women should not have children before the age of 20, at least, because by the age of 20, you have at least some idea of what you would like to do with your life. And if you are now having to take care of two children, or maybe more, it depends, your choices now are severely limited. It's not impossible, but they are now going to be severely limited because you have to find a babysitter. It's that simple. So he says if women can hold off on having kids before the age of 20, they at least have a chance to think about what they would like to do with their life. And also, previous sexual experience should help to distinguish between mere physical attraction and a successful marriage. In other words, cohabitating beforehand, living together. Again, remember, this is the 1930s he's writing this, and he is saying men and women should live together and find out whether they truly love each other and they can live with one another and they don't drive each other nuts. So that is a kind of an important thing. And so you may have a physical attraction to a person, but you want to know that that physical attraction is going to deepen and become something that flourishes within that monogamous relationship. If, on the other hand, it turns out to be just a fling and that physical attraction kind of dissipates, you now have not entered into a marital contract with that person. You can leave a lot more easily. So previous sexual experience would be the way in which individuals, and again, notice he's not saying just men. He's implying that both men and women should do this. Get some experience and be able to tell the difference between just, a fancy, an attraction, a sexual attraction, and love. If it truly is love, then that's a pretty solid foundation. And if both of you who both have experience choose to do this, it's more likely to work. The third one, again, equally important for both men and women, divorce should be possible without blame or disgrace to either party. And this is something that is also very important. In this idea of making marriage more difficult but divorce easier is an idea that's been around almost since the 1800s. But once again, it would often benefit the man, right? The husband of the family. They would basically escape with everything, and the now divorced wife was left with nothing. So Russell is trying to address these things and says, for example, the divorce should be much easier. There should be no blame on either party. And finally, the last one, right? Sexual relations should be freed from economic factors. Otherwise, wives become little more than prostitutes. And here is an idea presented in the 1930s that could that could eventually one day lead to a caretaker, someone that is at home taking care of kids, actually getting a wage from the government. Baby bonus is kind of this. It's kind of something along the same lines. If you have a child, you've collected baby bonus, and certainly it's increased substantially over the last 20 years, roughly. Not enough to live on, but it's enough for a woman that if she were in a predicament where she would have to leave, she would at least have some money in the bank. And Russell is presenting this idea because that was not the case. Women would literally be left penniless and homeless and ostracized, and the worst of all possible situations, and then saddled with a couple of kids. So for all of these reasons, Russell is not throwing away monogamy, but is saying, look, we need to reconfigure the social relations that lie outside of monogamy. And, for example, women to think twice about having kids at a young age. Get some sexual experience so you can tell the difference between just a fancy and true love. That if there is a divorce once you enter into monogamy, it's split 50-50. And whatever you walked in with is what you walk out with, and whatever's collected during the time is split 50-50, and that sexual relations and economic relations should be two separate things. That women should be allowed to work. Women should be allowed to, in Canada, we have a baby bonus, should be allowed to keep that. So they have some financial independence, because without that, that is a very unequal relationship. That monogamous relationship is unequal from an economic point of view, and that's very dangerous. Okay, so we're back now to the more sort of qualitative aspects of monogamy, which is modesty and jealousy and these kinds of things. These ideas are still there. People still can be jealous as much as they can be modest and not wish to talk about their sexual lives. It's entirely up to people to discuss or not discuss these factors. So through modesty, we end up in a situation where we don't want to talk about certain things that deeply affect us because we either feel ashamed or embarrassed. And Russell is kind of implying that, no, we need more honest discussions. So yes, 1930s, I would like to say we've come a long way. We're more willing to talk about these issues now and these matters in a more open, non-judgmental way, because this is what both McMurtry and Russell are saying, is not just peer pressure, but community pressure and public opinion. If we can talk in a more open way about issues that we've had of a sexual nature, and people are not judging us, but are simply listening and offer suggestions and recommendations and things, we're going to go a long way. So that's one of them. But the other one too that's just as difficult to deal with is jealousy, because the jealousy, right? It harnesses up to anger and murder. These things, and it does happen. We know this happens, and this is a serious, serious problem. So, if this is an issue that is going to be affecting monogamy and marital relationships between two individuals, then we need to figure out how we're going to deal with jealousy and be able to diffuse it well before it grows into sexual violence or, at the worst, murder. We need to be able to deal with that. And finally, the issue of paternity. Fatherhood and patriarchy wouldn't exist without it, because it is a notion of passing down inherited wealth from one, usually from the eldest son to the next. Things have changed slightly since, but the notion that paternity really is built on male wealth being handed down more so than female wealth. This is a very new thing, but male wealth handed down to the right heir, right? This heir that truly is the son of the mother that this individual is married to. These issues really matter, because not that paternity will fall apart, but there will always be the possibility that someone may inherit something that is not rightfully theirs. And we need to make sure that if paternity continues to exist, that it's done properly. But these are issues that Russell says are still difficult to talk about because they're personal, right? Modesty and jealousy and sexual inadequacies and these kinds of things are loaded with value judgments that other people are more than willing to give you their 2 cents. So what do we have now that is going to make monogamy at least slightly better, and will address some of the issues raised originally by Russell in the 1930s and then McMurtry in the 1980s? Then that is gender equality. So gender equality still has a long way to go, but is certainly on the right track. If we have gender equality that is entrenched in law, and we do, then it makes matrimony and monogamy at least possible and on a more equal footing, right? This is a couple of ideas that are very serious and worthy of discussion for both McMurtry and for Russell. So, exact from men, the same kind of fidelity that was previously exacted from women, that men have to be more honest, and men have to curtail their sexual activities. So then that would compromise possibly prostitution. But the notion that men screwing around should be frowned on in just the very same thing that was originally, and for many, many years, focused almost exclusively on women. It was almost sort of accepted that men would have, prostitutes that they would visit or would have someone else on the side. And yet if a woman had that, oh my God, that's it, end of the world. So Russell says, no, that should work for both partners. And to allow both sexes a certain relaxation of the traditional codes of sexuality. So we need to be able to speak more honestly. That degree of modesty maybe has been harming us rather than helping us. And we need to then turn around and be able to speak openly about the sexual knowledge that we require to make these proper decisions. And the best way to do it is through education, is to educate people as to what is correct and incorrect behavior, moral and immoral, ethical and unethical. And so Russell, and again, writing in the 1930s, says there's no reason to conceal sexual facts when talking to children. Now, clearly address it in a language that they understand, but certainly to involve the child. If the child is intelligent enough to ask a question, they're, I think, intelligent enough to get an answer, a reasonable answer that will at least put them on the right track to understanding what adult sexuality is all about. So, no matter what, there is always going to be that impulse to jealousy, which is a more sort of property-oriented idea, and polygamy, to sow one's wild oats, as they say. It's not necessarily universal, because there are communities that anthropologists have found where there is no jealousy and it's all polygamy. And so you have children born into the community and raised by the community. So the notion of inheritance goes out the window. So in the meantime, what do? So if we are going to try to balance this notion of jealousy / property rights or polygamy and multiple sexual partners, what Russell says, maybe men and women should simply be more tolerant, be a little kinder to one another, be more truthful to one another, and be more fair. Because if someone does feel a degree of isolation or sexual frustration, we should allow ourselves the ability, or at least the opportunity, to openly communicate this rather than act on it. And that's really what Russell is saying. So if we are educated and we have the language to describe these feelings, rather than act on them and destroy the relationship, maybe we should try to talk through it first. So key points once again: monogamy, one marriage, considered a form of ownership over another human being's sexuality. This is McMurtry. He looks at it as a form of a contractual obligation. Only two partners involved in the marriage, no more than one marriage at one time, and those two married individuals cannot have sexual relations outside of the marital contract itself. The need for regulations over sexuality is the reason why monogamy came into being in the first place. And some of the arguments concerning monogamy, the notion of affective relationships and a loving context for child rearing, can also occur in a polygamous relationship or in a relationship of polyamory. So there are two alternatives to monogamy where those two ideas that were inherent to monogamy now exist elsewhere. We also want to make sure that those formal exclusions from sexual contact with other individuals, when that does happen, it simply promotes insecurity, jealousy, alienation, all the things that will destroy that monogamous relationship. And then finally, we need to look at the various alternatives. We looked briefly at prostitution, polyamory, polygamy, And at least if women have the same sexual freedom that men have had for a very long time, the likelihood of a monogamous relationship being built from the beginning much stronger, it's more likely to succeed because it's not an unequal relationship. It's not as if the social prestige belongs exclusively to the man. There is an economic relationship of fairness, gender equality. Both partners are entering into that relationship on an equal footing. And if that doesn't happen, then there are going to be some problems. And then finally, Russell offers some ideas. One, that women really shouldn't have kids before the age of 20, so they have a chance to decide what to do with their life. Previous sexual experience is valuable because then you can tell the difference between an infatuation and true love. Divorce should not be a blame game, but in fact should be easier for both partners, no disgrace involved, and that everything should be done to free sexuality from economics. Because when you have a partner that gives up, typically a woman will give up her job to enter into a monogamous relationship, to raise a family. She may not have a source of income. And if the relationship falters, it makes it very difficult for that particular individual to pick up the pieces and start again. Now, things have changed. That's true, because Russell was writing in the 1930s. But some of these ideas now are just part of the environment. People now think about these things. And as a result, when people enter into a marital agreement, into a marital contract, they do it as two equal partners. They now become interdependent with one another. So that's basically monogamy. So I will be back very shortly to wrap up this term and this course with a discussion on terrorism and state-sponsored torture of terror suspects. See you shortly.